Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, January 27th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine expects to get all the weapons that it wants. So, shortly after President Biden announced that Ukraine would be getting the Western made tanks that it has been seeking, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, started demanding fighter jets and longer range missiles. They're asking for more. And Ukrainian officials have been lobbying for months to receive F-15 or F-16 fighter jets from the U.S. and the Army Tactical Missile Systems, which is a munitions that has a range of up to 190 miles, which is a lot more than the other missiles that the U.S. has been sending. The HIMARS right now are equipped with missiles that can fire up to 50 miles about, I believe. So that would be a pretty significant increase. And the U.S. has held off on providing such arms due to concerns that they could be used to target Russian territory. But the U.S. has previously ruled out other equipment that it eventually sent to Ukraine anyway, including the Abrams tanks. I mean, just a few days before Biden made his announcement, the Pentagon officials were saying it wouldn't happen. They previously ruled out the Patriot missiles. They previously ruled out the HIMARS. So this is a pattern, and the Ukrainian officials are confident that they're going to get what they want. So Yuri Sak, he is an advisor to Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov. He told Reuters on Thursday that he's confident Ukraine will get everything it wants. He said, quote, "They didn't want us to get heavy artillery, then they did. They didn't want to give us HIMARS systems, then they did. They didn't want to give us tanks, now they're giving us tanks. Apart from nuclear weapons, there is nothing left that we will not get," end quote. So, very confident. And, I would say that he's probably right in the direction that everything is going. He said that the next big hurdle would be getting fighter jets. He said, quote, "If we get them, the advantage on the battlefield will just be immense. It's not just F-16s, fourth generation aircraft. This is what we want," end quote. So they're looking to get other, modern Western made fighter jets. And Politico reported on Thursday that conversations between Western military officials on supplying Ukraine with advanced aircraft are already underway. They're already talking about it. And Lockheed Martin said the other day that they're ready to go. They're going to have F-16s ready to go. They're ramping up production. And Russia continues to warn against these escalations of military aid. Really, they're starting to really risk a lot here, especially, fighter jets. Tanks definitely is an escalation, but I feel like fighter jets is a huge escalation, just because it could give them the ability to really strike deep inside of Russia. And Russia, the New York Times acknowledged on Wednesday that by sending tanks, by increasing military aid like this, the U.S. is inching closer to a direct clash with Russia. And then this next one here is related. The Kremlin says that NATO's direct involvement in the Ukraine war is growing. So they said this on Thursday, in response to the U.S. and Germany sending these tanks and other equipment. It wasn't just the heavy tanks in the month of January. It was also the Bradley fighting vehicles, Germany's fighting vehicles. I believe they're called the Martyr. And then also the U.S. Striker, and France is sending something similar. Just been huge escalations in January. So Peskov, he said, quote, "There have been repeated statements from the European capitals and from Washington that the sending of various weapon systems, including tanks, to Ukraine by no means signifies the involvement of these countries or the alliance in the hostilities in Ukraine. We strongly disagree with this. Moscow perceives everything that both the alliance and the capitals I mentioned have been doing as direct involvement in the conflict. We see that it is growing," end quote. So there's no shortage of Russian officials making comments like this. If you go to TASS, which is a Russian news agency, English language, and you just search tanks, search escalation, things like that, you'll see all sorts of Russian officials making similar statements, saying that, the US and NATO are directly involved in this war. And US and other Western officials have typically downplayed that idea, but as we saw earlier in the week, Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she said that Germany and its allies were fighting a war against Russia. That's how she put it. And President Biden, he really tried to downplay sending the tanks by claiming that they did not pose an offensive threat to Russia. But Russian officials clearly do not see it that way, and they view this move as a major escalation. So Sergei Karaganov, he is a former advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin. So he's not currently in the government, but this was still a meaningful quote, I think. He said this to Al Jazeera. He said that Russia could retaliate against NATO countries in response to the new aid. He said, quote, "By sending tanks, the NATO countries are becoming more openly involved in the war, and that makes them potential targets," end quote. So again, the calculation here by the U.S. is that, they haven't retaliated so far. They haven't bombed a NATO base or used a nuclear weapon, so let's just keep going. It's just really a dangerous way of thinking. All right, so this next one here, the U.S., the White House refuses to say if Ukraine will get toxic depleted uranium ammunition. So the White House has refused to say so the Bradley fighting vehicles that the U.S. is sending Ukraine can be equipped with depleted uranium ammunition. And depleted uranium rounds are radioactive. It's typically created as a byproduct of producing enriched uranium, and uranium fuel. And it's an extremely dense metal, and it makes it an effective material to pierce the armor of tanks. And Bradleys can be equipped with this ammunition, which is why they are known as tank killers. Now, depleted uranium is linked to cancer and birth defects, and there's a lot of examples of this, particularly in Iraq. So when asked on Wednesday if the Bradleys that the U.S. is sending will be equipped with this uranium, a senior Biden administration official said that he was not going to get into the technical specifics. And the official also declined to answer if the M1 Abrams tanks that the U.S. is providing Kiev will be equipped with a depleted uranium cage, sort of some kind of special armor that they have. So what's kind of concerning is that there's a Russian official, Konstantin Gavrilov. He is the head of Russia's delegation in Vienna on arms control. He warned that Russia would view the use of depleted uranium weapons in Ukraine as the use of a dirty bomb. So that's kind of unsettling, because if Russia views it as a dirty bomb, how would they retaliate? He also claimed that Germany's Leopard 2 tanks could also be equipped with depleted uranium rounds. He said, quote, "In case such munitions for NATO-made heavy weapons are supplied to Kiev, we will consider that as the use of dirty nuclear bombs against Russia with all the consequences that come with it," end quote. So sort of a big warning there. And now this depleted uranium, again, Iraq is really the big example. After the Gulf War, the U.S. fired an estimated 1 million depleted uranium rounds. That's a lot. And after that, cancer and birth defects really spiked in Iraq. And the U.S. also used this depleted uranium in its 2003 invasion and, the war that followed. And studies have found that birth defects are more common in areas where depleted uranium was used. And birth defects are still common in Fallujah, because Fallujah, was under, there's so much fighting, and the U.S. used so much ammunition on that city. They destroyed that city really twice, back in the main battle, but then again when ISIS took control of the city. So it's still today. And I actually linked to, it's a Twitter account about, there's a Twitter account, and there's also a Facebook page from this hospital that posts, babies born with birth defects in Fallujah, and it happens all the time. And if you scroll through there, you see some pretty horrific defects. A lot of babies die right away because of how bad they are. So this is part of the U.S. legacy in Iraq that few people know about. And the U.S., U.S. government funded research kind of disputes that it's linked to cancer. But there's other examples, the Gulf War syndrome, part of that they say is because of the depleted uranium. And Italian soldiers during the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia, they got cancer. And I believe the Italian government, said, it's because of the depleted uranium. So this is something that they could be sending over for Ukraine to use against Russia. All right. So the next article here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The U.S. expands sanctions against Russia's Wagner Group. The U.S. Treasury Department placed the Wagner Group, which is the Russian mercenary company, and several of its affiliates on a blacklist. The move comes as the mercenary force helps the Kremlin capture cities in eastern Ukraine. The Treasury stated that the sanctions would degrade the Russian Federation's capacity to wage war against Ukraine. 8 individuals and 16 entities, as well as 4 aircraft, were placed on a blacklist. Secretary of the Treasury Janet L. Yellen said, today's expanded sanctions on Wagner, as well as new sanctions on their associates and other companies enabling this Russian military complex, will further impede Putin's ability to arm and equip his war machine. In December, the Biden administration claimed that the Wagner Group was leading an assault on Bakhmut, and the Wagner Group has been fighting a lot on the ground there. They were the first ones to say that they captured that city of Soledar. They've been doing a lot of the fighting in eastern Ukraine. And Kyle mentions that Russia is not the only country to use mercenaries to achieve its war goals. The U.S. used soldiers hired by the firm Blackwater to fight in Iraq, and the notorious massacre that happened in September 2007. They killed 17 Iraqi civilians. And in December 2020, President Trump pardoned the 4 men convicted of the war crime. And now that I'm thinking about Iraq again and the birth defect thing, I said Fallujah was taken over by ISIS. Is that right? Or maybe it was Mosul that I was thinking of. Sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head. But I just know that that city was destroyed. Oh, yeah, no, it was overtaken by ISIS. So yes, there was a few battles, big battles around that city. All right, sorry. The next one, the U.S. and Israel, they wrap up their largest ever military exercises aimed at Iran. So the U.S. and Israel on Thursday announced the conclusion of their largest ever joint military exercise known as Juniper Oak 23. The drills were launched Monday and involved over 140 aircraft and nearly 8,000 troops from both militaries. The massive show of force was clearly a provocation toward Iran, despite claims from U.S. officials that it was not aimed at any one country. CENTCOM said that the drills included a live fire exercise that involved B-52s, F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, FA-18s, AC-130s, AH-64s, 12 naval assets, HIMARS, multiple rocket launch systems, and a mix of jet fighters and long-range bombers. So that's a lot of firepower, and it was live fire exercises. So besides sending a message to Iran, the massive exercise demonstrates that the U.S. has Israel's back in the region, despite Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's new controversial government, which has pledged to expand settlements in the West Bank and eventually annex the territory. And they've said a lot of other things. They're planning to do a lot of other things that people are not happy about. And Netanyahu's new government is also full of Iran hawks, including his national security advisor, Hanegbi. And before the new government was formed, he threatened that Netanyahu could attack Iran. And so, again, they're acting like this isn't aimed at Iran, but it's just so obviously is. I mean, how else are people supposed to take this? So we might see more stuff like this. This drill came after Israel's former army chief visited Washington, D.C. in November and said upon his return that the two countries would expand joint military cooperation. All right. So I want to take this moment to mention still our fundraiser. We're getting really close to the finish line here, and we just need a little help, to push us through to the end. So you can go to antiwar.com/donate. Again, this fundraiser went very well for us, and we're very appreciative of all the support. And a special thank you to Roger Waters and other donors that put up larger amounts in matching funds, and we still have some matching funds left, so you can still double your impact if you go to antiwar.com/donate. It's how we get by. It's how I'm able to do this show and give you all this content, is because we're we're reliant on our readers to help get us by here. So help us wrap up so we could focus on providing you with all this bad news. Antiwar.com/donate. All right, so the next one. So there's a huge Israeli raid in the West Bank, and 10 Palestinians were killed, or 9 were killed in the raid, and 1 was killed later during a protest. So this is from Mondo Weiss. They're a good source on Israel and Palestine. In a brutal assault on the Jenin refugee camp Thursday morning, Israeli forces killed 9 Palestinians and injured over a dozen others, making it the deadliest day for Palestinians in 2023, and one of the single deadliest raids in the West Bank in years. A 10th Palestinian was killed later in the day in Al-Ram during clashes with the Israeli army. So according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, among those killed was an elderly woman identified as Magda Obaid. She was 61 years old, and 8 others were killed. According to the Defense for Children International Palestine, 2 of the Palestinians killed during the raid were children. 1 was 17 and 1 was 16. So they have a ton of details on this, but I'm just going to scroll down just to describe the raid. So the raid began at 7:15 a.m. on Thursday morning when undercover Israeli special forces entered the camp in a commercial truck. According to local sources, the special forces were targeting the apartment of Allah Sabag, who is a former leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Fatah's armed wing, who was killed by Israeli forces in the camp in 2002. So it was his old apartment. And his home was reportedly being used by a number of fighters affiliated with the Jenin Brigade, which is an armed resistance group from the camp composed of fighters from various political factions. Israeli forces fired rocket launchers and other explosives at the apartment building, causing the fighters inside to respond with live ammunition. The attack on the apartments also sparked clashes in the surrounding areas, with armed fighters firing towards the Israeli troops. And I believe no Israeli forces were killed or even wounded in this little battle here. So shortly after the operation began, hundreds of Israeli troops raided the area with a convoy of military jeeps and bulldozers entering the boundaries of the camp. Sources told Mondo Weiss that as the bulldozers moved through the streets, they destroyed cars parked in the area and everything in their wake. So if you look at pictures, the apartment building is, looks pretty destroyed and burnt out. So a pretty bad situation. And now this risks really sparking things. I mean, January, I believe 30 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank already, or 29. And 2022 was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2004. So now Israel is I believe some rockets were fired from Gaza over this. And I saw some unconfirmed reports of Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, but again, unconfirmed at this point. I'm not sure what's going on there, but something could really pop off here, especially with this new government. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. asks Israel to send its Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. So the U.S. asked Israel, so this Hawk anti-aircraft system is very old. Israel first bought them in the 1960s, but they haven't been used in at least 10 years, and they've been in storage, getting dusty. So the U.S. said, hey, can we send these over to Ukraine? So this was from Axios citing U.S. and Israeli officials. And one of the Israeli officials said that the Israeli Defense Ministry told the Pentagon that its policy of not sending weapons to Ukraine remains unchanged. Another official said that Israel insisted the Hawk systems were too old and couldn't be used, even though they could be refurbished. So Israel has provided Ukraine with humanitarian and other types of aid, but has held off on sending weapons. The previous Israeli government condemned the invasion and accused Moscow of war crimes, but the new government under Netanyahu has signaled that that policy will change. So Israel's position here is interesting, that they haven't sent weapons. And again, the previous government had a lot to say, but Israel's new foreign minister, Eli Cohen, said that the new government will talk less. And other officials said that they want to take a mediating role in the conflict. And Blinken, when he first spoke with Cohen, when the new government came in, he reportedly passed a message for Cohen to send to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And chief among Israel's desire to avoid escalating tensions with Russia, by arming Ukraine is its operations in Syria. Israel frequently bombs Russia's ally in Damascus, and while Moscow occasionally demands the airstrikes to stop, it never actually takes action to stop them. So they kind of have a understanding in Syria, and I don't think Israel wants to really mess with that. All right. So the next one here, this is from Jason Ditz. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, falsely claims that Iran could fuel several nuclear weapons. So this was Rafael Grossi. He's the head of the IAEA. He claimed that if Iran chose to do so, they could fuel several nuclear weapons from their existing stockpile of uranium. And the accusation is a continuation of Grossi's past suggestions, fueling immediate media frenzy about a proliferation threat and showing a flagrant lack of understanding for the facts of a nuclear program, let alone the status of Iran's stockpile. Under the suspended JCPOA nuclear deal, Iran was to send excess uranium from its stockpile abroad to keep it growing too large. So that was the deal. But since the U.S. hasn't been in the deal, nobody's taking Iran's stockpile of uranium. And they're currently enriching some at 60%, and they have about 70 kilograms at 60%. That's the highest they've ever done it. And they moved to that level in response to an Israeli sabotage attack on their nuclear program. So that's what, you know, Israel's covert action usually results in, is Iran increasing its nuclear program when Israel says that, you know, that's not what they want, but that's always what they get when they bomb their facilities and assassinate their scientists. So the important facts of the case, however, are more practical. So the term weapons-grade uranium refers to uranium which could be used in an atomic weapon and is of a minimum 90% purity. So really, the bottom line here is they don't have any uranium enriched at 90%. So that they can't really make weapons. So what Grossi's saying isn't really true. And Iran has never attempted to produce the 90% enriched uranium. So the IAEA is no doubt aware of all this, but they consistently present this highly enriched uranium of 60% as a problem. So from how I understand it, you know, anything below 20% or 20% and below is low enriched uranium. Anything above it is highly enriched uranium. And they do say, like, once you get to the point of, like, they could quickly make weapons grade uranium if they wanted to, but they haven't done it yet. And the Pentagon has admitted that Iran's not making a nuclear weapon, but you still always see stories like this in the media. And it, I think, shows how politicized the IAEA is on this issue. Never have anything to say about Israel's secret nuclear weapons program, which we know they have a few hundred nuclear warheads that are not subject to any kind of inspection. But we never hear about that. All right, so the next one, the U.S. says that they killed an ISIS leader in Somalia. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Thursday said that U.S. forces conducted a raid in northern Somalia that resulted in the killing of a senior ISIS leader, Bilal al-Sudani. And this marks a rare U.S. operation in the country that did not target al-Shabaab. So a Biden administration official, quoted by the New York Times, said that the raid also killed 10 Sudanese ISIS associates, which was a strange way to word it. Both Austin and administration officials claim that no civilians were killed. Of course, they claim that. They always do. But they shared very few details about the raid. And we always have to mention that the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting or simply lying about civilian casualties. And I linked to the fact that they knew that Kabul drone strike in Afghanistan in August 2021 killed civilians, but they lied to it about the media. General Mark Milley called it a righteous strike when they already knew that civilians were killed. And I just have to mention that again, because all the write-ups of this, you know, from the New York Times, from CNN, other places I saw, just repeat what the Pentagon, what Austin and the U.S. military officials said. They repeat it as fact, even though they know they lie about this stuff. I mean, the New York Times just recently, excuse me, they were the ones that broke the story, that found out, their investigation found that drone strike in Kabul killed 10 civilians. They recently just had this whole dump about how the Pentagon was hiding civilian casualties in its air war against Somalia. In its air war against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So they know, but they still just put out these stories that are basically Pentagon press releases. So the U.S. has launched frequent raids and airstrikes against ISIS in Syria over the past year and always claims that senior leaders are killed, but they never offer any kind of evidence for its claims. Austin claimed that al-Sudani was responsible for fostering the growing presence of ISIS in Africa and for funding the group's operations worldwide, including in Afghanistan. The administration official said that the raid was carried out by U.S. Special Operations Forces, who planned on capturing al-Sudani, but the response from his associates resulted in his death. So it sounds like they don't know if they were really ISIS fighters or if they were just hanging out with this guy by calling them associates. So again, this raid comes as the U.S. has been escalating its airstrikes against al-Shabaab in Somalia, something that I am always talking about, but is covered virtually nowhere else. All right, so the last news story here, the U.S. Marine Corps opens a new base on Guam to prepare for a future war with China. So the U.S. Marine Corps on Thursday formally opened a new military base in the U.S. territory of Guam, and this is part of Washington's military buildup in the Asia-Pacific that is aimed at China. So the base is still under construction, but it will eventually house 5,000 U.S. Marines, likely by the end of 2024. According to the Wall Street Journal, the purpose of the base is to prepare for a potential war with China in the islands of the Western Pacific Ocean. David Berger, he's the Commandant, General David Berger, he's the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He said that U.S. Marines would be the first to be deployed in the event of a war with China. He said, quote, "We don't want the..." Sorry, this is kind of a strange quote, the way he worded this. He said, quote, "We don't want to fight to get to the fight. We want to already be inside. So if there's a conflict, the stand-in forces are already forward," end quote. So they don't want to fight to get to the fight. They want to be there ready to fight for a future war with China. And we also saw recently the top U.S. Marine Corps general in Japan saying that the U.S. was setting the theater in the Asia Pacific as it set the theater in Ukraine after 2014. The Marine Corps has been revamping to better prepare for war with China by creating units that are more mobile and can quickly move around islands in the region. The U.S. is deploying one of these units, known as a Marine Littoral Regiment, to Okinawa by 2025, and they will be armed with anti-ship missiles. According to Kyoto News, the new base in Guam will host 4,000 U.S. Marines that will be transferred from Okinawa. So they're moving some Marines from Okinawa. It's part of an agreement as the U.S. agreed to reduce the military burden on Okinawa, which hosts over 70% of U.S. bases in Japan, because there's a lot of local opposition to this U.S. military presence. But the plans to deploy the Marine, on the other hand, they're going to deploy this Marine Littoral Regiment with new missiles. So that will further entrench the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. So, but what's interesting is that there's also local opposition to the expansion of the U.S. military presence in Guam, as Kyoto reported. I didn't see this in any of in the Wall Street Journal or any of the other American media outlets. So when the Marines opened this base, an anti-base demonstrators showed up and they protested the opening of the facility. And one activist said that the military buildup will make Guam a target for a war that we didn't want to be a part of. So it's interesting to see that concern on Guam. And that's the big issue that people on Okinawa have. You know, historically, I forget the numbers, but I mean, during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II, hundreds of thousands of Okinawan civilians were killed. It was a brutal battle. And, you know, they don't want something like that to happen again to them. But that's it for the news. That was a lot of information that I packed in there. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Guy Somerset. Oh, I'm not logged in. Warmongers 101. Who is the Institute for the Study of War? One from Eric Margulies. Halt this crazy rush to all-out war. It's on his website. One from Ben Norton. The Federal Reserve's misleading graph exaggerating China's military spending. That's over at Geopolitical Economy. We have one from Ben Armbruster. Media helps launder U.S. military PR on joint drills with Israel. That's at Responsible Statecraft. And then the Spotlight, Ted Snyder, he's our regular columnist, but this is over at the American Conservative. If Ukraine is right, Russia was right. But that is everything. That's it for the week. Again, help us push through, finish up our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. If you listen on audio, that's great. Share it around, leave reviews, all that good stuff. That's it for me for today. That's it for the week. I'll be back after the weekend. Thanks for listening.